She didn't choose this. She was sold into it. And the man holding the contract doesn't lose. Serena Vale had 48 hours to decide whether to marry a monster or watch her brother bleed out on a warehouse floor. No courthouse. No escape route. No one coming to save her. Just a table, a contract, and Dante Moretti sitting across from her like he'd already signed her future before she walked through the door. If you've ever had to sacrifice everything to protect the people you love, drop your city in the comments and hit that like button. Let's see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. Bottom. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. Serena was behind the counter of the dry cleaning shop on Keller Street, the one her mother had kept running through sheer stubbornness after the collapse, when the man in the gray suit walked in. He wasn't a customer. He didn't even pretend. He set the envelope on the glass counter without looking at her, turned around, and left. No name, no return address. Just a wax seal pressed into cream-colored paper. A single letter M stamped in black. She didn't open it in the shop. She waited until her lunch break, sitting in the alley behind the building on an overturned plastic crate. And even then, her hands didn't shake. That was the thing about growing up inside a slow financial collapse. The shaking stopped eventually. You ran out of adrenaline somewhere around the third time the bank called about the same account. Inside the envelope was a single photograph and 3 typed sentences. The photograph was of her brother, Marcus, 19 years old, standing outside the parking garage near his college campus, wearing his green jacket, the one with the broken zipper he kept meaning to fix. He was looking at his phone, completely unaware. The timestamp in the corner read 7:42 a.m. That morning. The 3 sentences said, "We know where he goes. We know when. Come to the address on the back alone, or we send someone to explain the debt in person." Serena sat in that alley for 60 seconds. She counted them. Then she folded the letter back into the envelope, tucked it inside her jacket, and went back to work for the remaining 4 hours of her shift, because rent on the shop was 3 weeks overdue, and she couldn't afford to lose a single hour of pay. This was the math of her life, everything calculated against the deficit. She went to the address that evening. It was a restaurant in Midtown, not the kind of place she'd ever been, with its dark paneling and ambient lighting and wait staff who moved like they'd been trained to disappear. A man met her at the door, young, wide through the shoulders, and walked her past the dining room to a private back section that was entirely empty except for one table and the man sitting at it. Dante Moretti. She recognized him the way you recognize something dangerous before you know exactly what it is, from the posture, from the stillness. He was lean, but not thin, dressed in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than 3 months of the shop's revenue, and he was looking at a glass of water like it had personally disappointed him. He didn't stand when she walked in. He didn't smile. He looked up at her the way you look at something you've already accounted for. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." Something moved across his face. Not surprise exactly. More like recalibration. "Sit down, Ms. Vale." She sat. He slid a folder across the table. She opened it and felt the room tilt slightly. Inside was a complete accounting of the Vale family's debt. Not just the public record, not just the business loans that had circled like vultures after her father's shipping company sank. Everything. The second mortgage on her mother's apartment she'd taken out 3 years ago. The private creditors her father had dealt with in the last year before his death. Men whose contracts didn't run through courts or attorneys. The money Marcus had borrowed from people who collected in ways that left marks. 2,400,000, Dante said. Give or take. I know what we owe. You know part of it, the part that's on paper. He leaned back. The part that isn't on paper is the part that concerns you. She looked at him steadily. What do you want? He told her. She laughed. Not because it was funny, because laughing was the only physical response she had left that wasn't screaming. You want to marry me? I want to acquire a legal partnership with certain documentation benefits, he said, and there wasn't a single thread of warmth in his voice. Marriage is the vehicle. I don't know what documentation you think I have. You have your father's legal identity on several holding structures he created between 2009 and 2013. Those structures have never been dissolved. He registered them in your name. You may not have known that. He paused. But I do. The air in the room felt different after that, thicker. She made herself breathe through it. What happens to Marcus? She said. His debts are absorbed. He doesn't hear from anyone connected to money again. And my mother. The apartment stays. The shop continues operating. He picked up his water glass, drank. No one touches your family. And if I say no? Dante set the glass down and looked at her directly for the first time. His eyes were dark, not dramatically dark, just dark the way a room with the lights off is dark, where you can't find the edges. Then the people your brother owes money to receive a call telling them that the Vale family has no intention to pay, and those people don't use lawyers. It wasn't a threat delivered with theater. It was delivered the way a weather forecast is delivered. This is what happens. Plan accordingly. Serena sat with it for a moment. She felt the weight of it pressing down through the chair into the floor. 2,400,000. Marcus's face in the photograph, looking at his phone, completely unaware that his life was being traded at a dinner table he'd never know about. How long? She said. The arrangement would need to hold for a minimum of 18 months to be legally credible. After that, terms are renegotiated. Terms, she said flatly. You mean I can leave? I mean the arrangement evolves based on mutual interest. She looked at the folder again, at the numbers her family had been drowning in for 7 years, at the photograph of Marcus she hadn't noticed until now, tucked beneath the financial documents. The same one from the envelope, a reminder that this conversation had a clock on it. She thought about her father, the way the company had collapsed so suddenly, so completely, in a way that never entirely made sense even when she stopped asking questions out loud. She thought about the year before he died, how thin he'd gotten, how he'd started locking his office door even at home. She thought about none of that for very long because it didn't change the math in front of her. I have conditions, she said. Dante's expression didn't shift. State them. Marcus doesn't know about any of it. He thinks it's real. Fine. My mother doesn't know either. Also fine. I maintain access to my own accounts. I keep working. I don't disappear into your house like some kind of... She stopped, started again. I stay myself. I have no interest in your daily schedule, Dante said. This is a business arrangement. I don't require a performance. She felt something strange in her chest at that. Not relief. Something colder. Like having a door closed that you hadn't realized you'd hoped might stay open. One more thing, she said. He waited. If anything happens to Marcus, if anyone so much as looks at him sideways, I said his debts are absorbed. I don't make promises I don't keep. I'm not asking about promises. I'm telling you what happens if you lie to me. She held his gaze. I'll burn every document you want from me before you ever see a single page. Silence. Then, for the first time, something flickered in Dante Moretti's expression. She couldn't name it exactly. It wasn't admiration. It wasn't amusement. It was the look of someone who had expected a certain kind of opponent and found a different one. Noted, he said. The wedding was 18 days later. City Hall. Small. A judge, 2 witnesses she didn't know, and Dante standing beside her in a dark suit that matched the circles under her eyes. Her mother thought she'd met someone in a rush of unexpected feeling. Serena had manufactured a story about a whirlwind, kept it vague, watched her mother cry happy tears that felt like swallowing broken glass. Marcus was there. He shook Dante's hand with the particular wariness of a younger brother doing the math on a man twice his sister's intimidation level. Dante was perfectly civil to him, perfectly calibrated. Said 3 things to Marcus total, each one exactly right for a man meeting his new brother-in-law without being so perfect it felt rehearsed. Serena noticed that, filed it away. The reception was a private dinner at the restaurant where the deal had been struck. 4 courses she barely tasted. By 9 p.m., a black car had taken her family home, and a different black car was taking her to a house in a part of the city she'd never had reason to go. The estate was set back from a private road behind a gate. She watched close behind them in the rearview mirror, stone exterior, security lighting. Men positioned at intervals she clocked without meaning to. Inside, a woman named Cora, 50s, precise, carrying a tablet, walked Serena through the east wing. showed her a set of rooms that had clearly been prepared with enough time and enough money that it looked effortless, which meant it was deliberate. A bedroom, a small sitting room, a bathroom with actual marble, a desk near the window with a view of a courtyard that was empty and lit with motion-sensitive floods. "Mr. Moretti is in the West Wing," Cora said. "Dinner is typically at 7. Breakfast is informal. The kitchen is available from 6. If you need anything during the night, this button here reaches the house staff." She pointed to a discreet panel near the door. "Is there anything else you need tonight, Mrs. Moretti?" The name hit differently than Serena expected, like walking into a door in the dark. "No," she said. "Thank you." She spent her first night in Dante Moretti's house, sitting in the chair by the window, watching the motion lights in the courtyard blink on and off as something small, a cat maybe, or just the wind moving through the hedges, triggered them in irregular intervals. She didn't sleep until almost 4 in the morning. She didn't cry at all. She'd made her trade, and she knew what it cost, and the only thing left now was to survive it. She was better at surviving than most people gave her credit for. She met Dante at breakfast 3 days in. He was at the kitchen island with coffee and a newspaper, actual newsprint, which surprised her. And he looked up when she walked in, registered her presence, looked back down. "Coffee's fresh," he said. "Thanks." She poured a cup and stood at the counter, and they existed in the same space for approximately 7 minutes without speaking, which was the most comfortable she'd felt since the envelope arrived. This became their pattern. Mornings were quiet. He left early. She spent her days at the shop on Keller Street. The car Dante had assigned to take her wherever she needed to go waited outside with a patience that she gradually stopped finding unnerving. She came back to the estate in the evenings. They ate dinner at 7, sometimes across from each other, sometimes not at the same table at all, depending on whether his work ran late. She learned things about him the way you learn things in a house you're living in, not from conversations, but from evidence. He took his coffee without anything. He read everything: newspapers, reports, the kind of thick documents that got delivered in sealed envelopes with no return addresses. He had an almost compulsive precision about where things were placed in his office, a room she walked past but never entered. He slept less than she did. He also, she noticed, spoke differently to the people who worked for him than she'd expected. Not warmly, but not with cruelty either. Direct, specific. When something was wrong, he said so without theater and told them how to fix it. When something was done well, he acknowledged it with a single sentence and moved on. There was no performance of power in any of it, which in her limited experience of powerful men was itself unusual. She didn't trust him. That wasn't the point. But she watched. 10 days into the marriage, she came downstairs at midnight for water and found 3 men she didn't recognize in the entry hall. They were dressed too well for the hour and carrying tension in their shoulders, the way men carry it when something has recently gone wrong. Dante was in the center of them, jacket off, speaking in low, rapid Italian. He stopped when he saw her. "Go back upstairs," he said. "I live here," she said. The 3 men looked at her, 2 of them with blank professional attention. The third, older, silver-haired, wearing a ring that caught the light, with something sharper that she couldn't entirely read. Dante said her name once, quiet and final, in a tone that wasn't anger, but was adjacent to it. She went back upstairs. She sat on the edge of her bed and listened to the sound of the front door closing, an engine starting, and the subsequent silence, and tried to understand what she was feeling, which turned out to be the specific cold alertness of someone who has just realized the building they're standing in has more floors than they were told about. 2 days later, she found the damage. She wasn't looking for it. She was walking to the east garden because Cora had mentioned there was a garden and she needed air, and she went through a side corridor she hadn't been in before, and there was Dante standing at a window with his back to her, and there was blood on the back of his shirt. Not a lot. A dark stain about the size of her palm between his shoulder blades, already dried. She stopped. He said without turning around, "Don't ask." "I wasn't going to," she said. That was also not entirely true. She went to the garden. She sat in it for 20 minutes and thought about the 3 men and the blood and the way he'd said her name in the entry hall, and decided to adjust her understanding of exactly what kind of arrangement she'd entered. She'd known it was dangerous. She hadn't mapped the specific geography of the danger. That needed to change. She started paying attention differently. Not obviously. She had enough sense not to be obvious about it. But she started listening to the conversation she was adjacent to, cataloging names she heard more than once, noticing which men came through the estate with the frequency of colleagues versus which ones came through with the compressed energy of problems. She started watching Dante the way she'd watched her father in the last year before his death, looking for the thing he was carrying that he wasn't saying out loud. 3 weeks into the marriage, a car tried to run her SUV off the road on the highway. She was coming back from Keller Street. Her driver reacted fast, faster than she would have expected, which told her he'd been prepared for the possibility. And the car that hit them spun out against the barrier, and she sat in the back seat breathing hard while her driver radioed something in rapid clipped language she couldn't fully follow and got them off the highway at the next exit. Dante was at the estate when they arrived. He was standing in the driveway before the car even stopped, which meant someone had called ahead, and he pulled open her door and his eyes ran over her once, fast and thorough, checking for damage. "I'm fine," she said. "Get inside." "I said I'm fine. Serena." He said it differently than the time in the hall. Not the same hardness. Something underneath it that she didn't have a word for yet. She got inside. He came to her sitting room 20 minutes later. He sat across from her, and there was a bruise forming along his jaw from something that hadn't happened tonight, and he told her straight that a rival organization, he didn't name them, which she noted, had decided that disrupting his operations by targeting his household was a viable strategy. That it wouldn't happen again. That her security detail was being doubled starting tonight. "Who were they?" she said. "People who made a miscalculation." Past tense. His jaw moved. Past tense. She sat with that. "I want to know things," she said. "I'm not asking to be involved. I'm not asking to sit at your meetings. But I need to understand the shape of what I'm living inside, Dante. I'm not built for being kept in the dark and told to go back upstairs." Something shifted in the room. "It's safer if you don't know." "You just told me someone tried to kill me on the highway." Her voice stayed even. "The time for safer if you don't know was 3 weeks ago." He looked at her for a long moment. The house was quiet around them. From somewhere in the West Wing, faintly, a phone rang and stopped. "I'll tell you what you need to know," he said finally. "Not everything, but what you need." "That's not good enough." "It's what I'm offering." She looked at him, at the bruise on his jaw and the stillness he wore like armor, and the thing she kept almost seeing underneath it that she couldn't quite name. "Fine," she said. "For now." For now was an agreement, but it was the beginning of something she didn't have a word for yet. Something between a negotiation and a territory. Something being slowly mapped by two people who had both spent their entire lives learning to read rooms for exits. She started sleeping again eventually. Not well, but enough. Then on a rainy Thursday morning, 5 weeks into the marriage, she found a file that had fallen behind the radiator in the east corridor. It was slim, unmarked, and had probably slipped out of one of the many sealed deliveries that moved through the estate. She almost put it aside, almost handed it to Cora to deal with. Instead, she opened it. Inside were financial records, wire transfers, holding companies, offshore structures. She recognized some of the company names, the shapes of them, the specific alphabet soup of letters that her father used to use when he talked about the business. She recognized one of the account numbers. Her hands went still. She recognized it because she had seen it before, years ago, in her father's private files. The one she'd spent 3 days going through after his funeral, crying and cataloging and trying to understand what had gone wrong and finding nothing that made sense. The account number was the same, but the transfers flowing through it were dated 4 months before her father's company collapsed, and the authorization signature on every single one of them wasn't her father's. She stood in the corridor with rain hitting the window and her heartbeat very loud in her ears and made herself read the page twice. 3 times. Because what it appeared to say, if she was reading it correctly, was that someone had been systematically stripping assets out of her father's company through this account for the better part of a year before the collapse. Someone who wasn't her father. Someone who had left her family drowning in manufactured debt for 7 years. She folded the file, tucked it inside her jacket, walked to her room and sat on the bed and breathed. At dinner that night, Dante was quiet in his particular way, focused inward, carrying something she could see in the set of his shoulders. She watched him across the table and thought about the file against her ribs and the account number and the signature she hadn't been able to fully make out. She thought about what it would mean if the collapse hadn't been her father's failure at all. If the debt that had run her family into the ground for 7 years had been built by someone else's hands. She thought about what it would mean that the same debt had been used to put her in this house. She almost told him. She was 3 words into deciding to tell him when he looked up from his plate, and something in his face made her stop. Not suspicion. Something more like careful, the expression of a man solving for a variable he hadn't disclosed. She swallowed the words. "Long day?" she said instead. "Always," he said. She went to bed that night with the file hidden in her room and the growing, cold certainty that the story she'd been told about her own life had been written by someone else entirely, and that she was still living inside it, and that the man across the dinner table from her might be a piece of it in ways she hadn't begun to understand. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle around her and made herself think clearly. She needed to know whose signature was on those transfers. She needed to know it before anyone realized she'd found the file. And she needed to figure out, very carefully, whether the man she'd married was someone she could trust with what she was beginning to uncover, or whether he was the one she needed to be protected from. Because somewhere between the highway and the blood on his shirt, and the way he'd pulled open her car door and looked at her like the damage would have been his fault, she'd stopped being certain of the answer. And uncertainty, in a house like this one, was the most dangerous thing she could afford. She spent 2 days doing nothing with the file. Not because she was afraid, or not only because of that. Because she understood, in the careful way she'd learned to understand things growing up inside a slow disaster, that the moment she moved on, information was the moment she revealed she had it. And she didn't know yet who in this house was safe to reveal anything to. So she waited. She watched. She went to the shop on Keller Street and pressed shirts and ran the register and talked to Mrs. Huang from the alterations place 2 doors down about the weather. And she came back to the estate every evening in the black car with the patient driver whose name she'd learned was Anton. And she ate dinner at 7 and went to bed and lay in the dark with the file tucked inside the lining of a coat in her closet and thought hard about signatures. The name she couldn't make out kept bothering her. The handwriting was cramped and old-fashioned, the kind that came from a generation that still took penmanship seriously, and the photocopy quality hadn't helped. She'd studied it until her eyes ached. The first letter looked like an L, maybe a capital L with a long downstroke. She needed the original. She needed something to compare it to. On the 3rd day, she found her angle. It came through Cora, who mentioned, entirely in passing, while reviewing the household calendar, that Dante was hosting a meeting the following afternoon in the estate's East Conference Room. Several people, starting at 2, running until 5 or 6 depending. Serena would probably want to be out of that wing. "Who's coming?" Serena said. Cora gave her the practiced look of someone whose job required them to be professionally uninformed. "Mr. Moretti's associates." "How many?" "Perhaps 6. A pause. "There's also Mr. Graves. He typically arrives early." Serena kept her expression easy. "Right. I'll stay out of the way." She'd heard the name Lucian Graves twice before, once in a phone call she'd been adjacent to, once in a conversation between Dante and a man named Reyes that had stopped when she walked into the room. She'd filed it under important without knowing yet why. Now she pulled it back out and looked at it harder. She didn't leave the wing. She positioned herself in the East Corridor's small reading room, a space off the main hall that had a door she could leave slightly open, and a chair positioned at an angle where she could see the conference room entrance without being visible from it. She brought a book. She didn't read it. Lucian Graves arrived at 1:40. He was 60, maybe 62, silver-haired, wearing a gray suit with a pocket square that matched precisely. He moved with the kind of ease that came from decades of rooms opening for you. He shook hands with Dante at the conference room door, and Serena watched Dante's face during that handshake. It was neutral, professionally warm. Exactly right. It was also slightly different from the face Dante made when he trusted someone. She'd been watching him long enough to know the difference, even if she couldn't have articulated it to anyone else. There was a fraction of increased stillness in his jaw, a millimeter of extra precision in his expression, the way a man's face goes when he is performing ease rather than feeling it. He didn't entirely trust Lucian Graves. She sat with that while the meeting gathered and the door closed and the reading room went quiet except for the rain that had started again outside. When the meeting broke at 5:30 and the men filed out in groups of 2 and 3, Serena watched from her angle. Lucian Graves was the last to leave the conference room. He stopped in the hallway to check something on his phone, and in the pause of that moment, with his head bent, she got a clear look at his left hand. The ring. Silver. Heavy. Catching the light. The same ring she'd seen on the silver-haired man in the entry hall the night she'd come downstairs and found 3 men standing with Dante in the dark. She pressed back into her chair and breathed. He'd been here before. At midnight. With blood on Dante's shirt 2 days later. And now he was here for a business meeting in the afternoon, shaking hands like a colleague, and Dante's face said trusted, but his jaw said careful. She needed to know whose ring that was. She needed to know what Lucian Graves' signature looked like. She waited until the estate had settled into its evening quiet before she found Anton in the kitchen, eating alone, and sat across from him with 2 cups of coffee, and the directness that she'd found worked better with men like him than any kind of approach. "Tell me about Lucian Graves," she said. Anton looked at her over his coffee. He was in his 40s, stocky, with the particular watchfulness of someone trained to notice things. He worked for Dante. He'd also, twice now, taken a bullet's worth of risk to keep her alive in a car that wasn't his car. She'd decided these things were not unrelated. "I'm not in a position to see—" "I know who you work for," she said. "I'm not asking you to be disloyal. I'm asking you what kind of man he is. That's different." Anton studied her for a moment. Then he said, "He's been with the organization 15 years, senior advisor, handles the financial structures, the international connections." "Does Dante trust him?" A beat. "He relies on him." "That's not what I asked." Another beat, longer. "There are people Mr. Moretti trusts with his life. Graves is not on that list." She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "Why does he keep him close then?" Anton's expression did something complicated. "Because knowing where a problem is beats not knowing." She thought about that for a long time after Anton left. She went to Dante that night. Not to his office. She'd never been in there. That was still a line she hadn't crossed. But to the small study adjacent to it, where she'd seen him sit in the evenings when the workday supposedly ended, but his mind didn't. She knocked. He said, "Come in." He was at the desk with a glass of something dark and a report she couldn't see the cover of. He looked up. "I have a question," she said. "You always have a question." "Lucien Graves." Something happened in his face. Not much, just a very slight alteration, the kind she'd learned to read as him recalibrating how much to say. "What about him? Was he at the house 6 weeks ago, at night, before we—" She paused. "Before the wedding." "Why are you asking?" "Because I saw him here 2 weeks ago, in the entry hall, at midnight, and you had blood on your shirt 2 days after that." She held his gaze. "I'm asking if the timeline connects." Dante set the report down. He was quiet for a moment that felt load-bearing. "He came to discuss a disagreement," Dante said. "It was handled." "What kind of disagreement?" "The kind that isn't your business." "Everything in this house is my business," she said. "That was the deal. You said you'd tell me what I need to know." "I said I'd tell you what you need, not everything you want." She felt the anger move through her chest, hot and precise. "There's a difference." "Yes," he said. "There is." She looked at him, at the glass in his hand and the closed report and the careful nothing of his expression. She thought about the file in her coat. She thought about the account number and the L that might be a capital L. She thought about telling him right now, putting it on the desk between them, watching his face. She decided not to. Not yet. "Fine," she said. She left. She didn't sleep. She lay in bed and felt the specific exhaustion of living in a house where every conversation was a negotiation and every silence contained information you weren't being given. She'd grown up in a family that hid things from each other out of love, out of the desire to protect. This was different. This was a house where things were hidden strategically, architecturally, by people who'd spent years building rooms within rooms within rooms and knew exactly which doors to keep locked. She was starting to understand that she'd walked into one of those rooms without a map. In the morning, she did something she hadn't done since moving in. She called Marcus. He picked up on the second ring, his voice carrying the particular background noise of a campus building. Feet on stairs, doors, a distant announcement. "Hey, you okay?" "I'm fine, I just wanted to hear your voice." "That's ominous." "It's not ominous. You've got your worried voice." She pressed her fingers against her temple. "How's school?" "School is school. How's—" A pause, the half-second of a 19-year-old trying to figure out how to reference his sister's new husband. "How's everything?" "Good. Everything's good." Silence between them that carried more than either of them said. "Serena." His voice had dropped. "You'd tell me if something was wrong." She looked out the window at the courtyard. Motion lights, empty hedges. The gate at the far end that was always closed. "I'd tell you what you needed to know," she said. A pause. "That's not the same thing." "No," she said. "It's not." She hung up, feeling hollow in the specific way you feel when you're protecting someone, and the protection itself is its own kind of damage. The attack happened 4 days later. She was in the estate's east garden in the early morning, a habit she'd developed, the only hour the place felt like somewhere she could breathe, when she heard the sound. Not an explosion, something sharper, a crack that the garden's stone walls bounced and multiplied until it was everywhere at once, and then Anton was across the garden in a way that covered the distance faster than she'd have thought possible, and had her by the arm and was moving. "Inside," he said. "Now, don't stop." She didn't stop. She ran because his hand on her arm said run, and because the sound had been a gunshot, and she understood, in the animal part of her nervous system, that the distance between her and inside was the only variable that mattered right now. She didn't see Dante until they were in the estate's interior corridor, the heavy door sealed behind them, and two men she recognized as part of the security detail positioned at the end of the hall. Dante came from the West Wing moving fast, jacket off, the particular focus on his face that she'd seen once before, the night of the highway. He reached her and stopped, and his eyes ran over her the same way they had that night. Checking. "I'm fine," she said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "Someone put a shooter on the east perimeter." He said it flat, factual, the way you report weather. "Single target, they missed." "Single target meaning me." "Yes." She felt something cold run the length of her spine. "Same organization as the highway?" "Different signature, different approach." He was looking past her now at something over her shoulder, talking to Anton in rapid Italian, then back to her. "You're not going to the shop today." "I need to—" "Serena." Sharp. "You're not going to the shop today." She shut her mouth. Not because she agreed, because she was doing the math on the fact that someone had tried to kill her twice in 3 weeks, and the second attempt had a different signature from the first, which meant possibly a different source, which meant possibly 2 separate problems, which meant the shape of what she was living inside was larger and more complicated than even the adjusted understanding she'd built over the past weeks. "Okay," she said. "Not today." The day was long and walled in. She stayed in the East Wing. Cora brought meals without being asked. Men moved through the corridors with the compressed efficiency of a house on alert. Through her window, she could see activity at the perimeter. Vehicles, men in positions that weren't normal positions. The gate opening twice to let in people who weren't the usual faces. At 3 in the afternoon, she heard raised voices from the direction of the West Wing. She moved toward them without entirely deciding to. The voices were coming from behind the study door, which wasn't fully closed, not open, but the latch hadn't caught, leaving a half-inch gap that was enough. She stood in the corridor and did not touch the door and listened. "Told you it was contained." 2 attempts in 3 weeks isn't contained, Lucienne. Dante's voice, controlled, but with something underneath it she hadn't heard before, a current of heat that the control was working hard to hold back. The first was Taviani's people reacting to the merger news. The second was professional. That wasn't Taviani. A pause. There are several possible sources. Stop! Dante's voice dropped, which was somehow more alarming than if it had risen. I need you to look at me and tell me you don't know where that shot came from. A long silence. I don't know with certainty. That's not what I asked. Another silence. Longer. Serena pressed her back against the corridor wall and breathed as quietly as she could and felt her pulse in her throat. There are factions, Lucian said finally, carefully, who believe the marriage created vulnerabilities, who feel that the girl represents a liability. She's my wife. She's an asset with documentation that several parties want access to. The question of who controls that access is not a question. Dante's voice was very quiet now. It is not open. The answer is she is under my protection, and anyone who moves against her moves against me. That is the answer, Lucian. That was always the answer. Serena stood in the corridor and felt those words land somewhere strange, in a place she wasn't expecting. Of course, Lucian said. His voice had the texture of agreement worn smooth over something that wasn't agreement at all. She moved away from the door before it could open. She went to her room and sat on the floor with her back against the bed. Not the chair, not the window, the floor, because sometimes the floor was the only surface that felt solid. And thought. Documentation. Lucian had said it. The girl represents a liability because of the documentation, which meant he knew about it. He knew why Dante had agreed to the marriage, which meant he knew more about the structure of the arrangement than she'd been told was known. She got up, went to the closet, got the file from inside the coat lining. She spread the pages on the floor and looked at the signature again. The capital L. The cramped, old-fashioned hand. She thought about Lucian Graves and his silver ring and his careful voice and 15 years in the organization and the way Dante's jaw had gone precise during that handshake. She needed his signature on something, anything. She started planning. Over the next 3 days, she moved carefully. She started appearing in the common areas of the estate at slightly different hours than she usually did. Small adjustments, nothing dramatic, just enough to begin mapping the household's rhythms from different angles. She learned that Lucian Graves came to the estate twice a week, always arriving through the west entrance, always spending time in the document room adjacent to Dante's office before the formal meetings. The document room. She hadn't been in it. But she knew it existed because she'd seen Cora carrying sealed folders to it, and she'd seen the light under its door when she passed the West Wing hallway late at night. She also started, with great care, watching Dante's responses to Lucian differently, looking for the specific texture of what he was managing, what he was watching for. She'd been right. There was something. A kind of lateral vigilance, the way you watch something in your peripheral vision, because looking directly at it would alert it to being watched. He knew, or suspected, something. He just hadn't told her. On the 4th day after the shooting, she found him in the kitchen again at an hour when the house was quiet, and she sat across from him and put her hands flat on the table and said, "You suspect someone inside the organization." He looked up slowly. "The shooting," she said. "You don't think it came from outside?" A long moment. He looked at his coffee, then at her. "What makes you say that?" "The way you talk to Graves, the way you've been operating since. You're not running defense against outside. You're running it against inside." She held his gaze. "How long have you known?" The silence stretched. "I don't know," he said. "I have a shape, not a certainty." "What's the shape?" He was quiet for a moment that felt like a decision being made. Then he said, "Someone has been rerouting operational funds through structures I didn't authorize. 15 months, maybe longer." He set the coffee down. "It's careful, professional. Someone who knows the system well enough to use it against itself." 15 months. The number hit her like a cold wave because 15 months ago was 9 months before she'd ever received that envelope. And if someone had been running a long game inside Dante's organization for 15 months, then the timeline of what she'd understood as her own crisis might be entirely wrong. "The funds," she said carefully. "Where are they going?" "Offshore, through a chain of shells." He looked at her. "Why?" She looked at her hands on the table. She thought about the file in the coat. She thought about her father's account number. She thought about what it would mean if the financial structures her father had hidden under her identity were connected to the shells Dante was describing. If the same network that had been draining her father's company had also been running money through Dante's organization for 15 months. If they were different tributaries of the same river. She thought about Lucien Graves and his precise handwriting and his 15 years of knowing exactly where every financial structure was buried. She looked up. "I need to show you something," she said. She got the file. She spread it on the kitchen table between them and watched his face as he read it. He was still, very still. The particular stillness of a man whose mind is running fast underneath a surface that's learned not to show speed. He read it twice. She watched his eyes. He didn't ask how she'd found it. He didn't ask how long she'd had it. He asked one question. "This account number," he said, pointing to the line she'd circled in pencil. "You recognize it?" "It was my father's private account, not connected to the business. He kept it separate." She swallowed. "The transfers going through it are dated the year before his company collapsed." Dante looked at the page, then at her. "The signature," he said. "I can't make out the full name, but the first letter, L," he said. "Yes." He sat back. She watched something move through his face, slow and heavy, like something settling into place that he hadn't wanted to see settled. "Dante," she said, "how long have you known Lucien Graves was the problem?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the file on the table between them, and his jaw was very tight. "I've known for 3 weeks that he was a possibility," he said. "I didn't want it to be true." "Because he's been with you 15 years. Because if it's him, then everything he touched for 15 years is compromised. Every structure, every connection, every deal he advised on." He looked at her. "It means the organization has been running on a foundation he was quietly hollowing out." The weight of it sat between them. "My father," she said. Her voice held, barely. "If he engineered the collapse, then your father didn't fail." Dante's voice was quiet. "He was destroyed." She pressed her fingers against her mouth for a moment. She'd spent 7 years carrying the weight of her father's failure. 7 years of the shop and the debt and the math and the sacrifices. All of it built on the story that her father had made mistakes, and the family had paid for them. And if that story was wrong, "The marriage," she said. "He knew about my father's documentation structures." "Yes." "He knew I had legal identity attached to them." "Yes." "Did he arrange it?" She looked at Dante directly. "Did Lucien push you toward the marriage?" The silence was the answer before he spoke it. "He brought me the intelligence on your family's situation," Dante said. "He identified you as a viable arrangement. He presented the documentation angle as beneficial to the organization." His voice was careful, precise, doing the work of staying controlled. "I thought I was making a strategic decision." "You were making the decision he wanted you to make." "Yes." She sat with that, with the enormous architectural wrongness of it. Her father's company, 7 years of debt, the envelope on a Tuesday, the restaurant in Midtown, the wedding that felt like a hostage exchange. All of it, every step of what she'd understood as her own desperate choice, had been arranged by a man who wanted access to documentation he could use to run billions through a network her father had unknowingly built the skeleton of. "He needed me inside this house," she said slowly. "He needed me where he could access what I have legally attached to my identity. And he needed me inside your protection so he could access the network through the Moretti structures at the same time." "He played both sides," Dante said. "Used me to acquire you. Uses the marriage as the mechanism." "And the attempts on my life." Dante's jaw tightened. "If someone inside the organization has been shooting at me," she said, "and you believe the shots came from inside, he's moving the timeline," Dante said. "He needs the documentation transferred before I figure out what he's done. If you're dead and I'm still your legal widower, there are structures that would allow—" He stopped. "Say it." "There are inheritance clauses your father built into the holding structures. If you die without dissolving them, control reverts to the named executor." He looked at her. "Lucien Graves notarized those structures in 2011. The room was very quiet. He's been planning this since 2011, she said. Since before your father died, Dante said. She stood up. She needed to stand. She walked to the window and looked at the courtyard and felt the specific, shattering sensation of understanding that a story you thought you were living was actually a story someone else had been writing around you for longer than you'd been aware enough to read it. Her father, dead, destroyed. And she'd spent 7 years blaming the market, blaming the economy, blaming the particular vulnerability of a man who'd built something big and watched it fall. She felt the grief of it like a physical thing, hot and sudden and enormous. She pressed it down. Later, not now. She turned around. We need proof, she said. Not suspicion, not the file. Something that ties his signature to my father's account with a chain of evidence that holds. Yes. He keeps records in the document room. Dante looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully interpret. How do you know about the document room? I've been paying attention. She held his gaze. I need access to it. It's not safe. If he thinks you know, he already thinks I'm a liability. He's already tried twice. She crossed her arms. The only difference between safe and what's happening right now is whether we get proof before he moves again. Dante was quiet. She could see him calculating, running the angles the way he always did, the silent, rapid math of risk and leverage. Not alone, he said finally. Obviously, not alone. Something passed between them in that moment. Not warmth exactly. Not trust in the comfortable sense of the word. Something harder and more specific. The mutual recognition of two people who had both been played by the same hand and were now, without quite deciding it, standing on the same side of the table. She looked at the file spread between them on the kitchen table, at her father's account number, and the L that was definitely a capital L, and the chain of 15 years of careful hollowing out that had cost her family everything and was still, right now, actively trying to cost her her life. Tomorrow, Dante said, when he comes for the Wednesday meeting, there's a window of 40 minutes when he's in the conference room and the document room is unoccupied. 40 minutes. It's enough. If you know what you're looking for. I know what I'm looking for, she said. She took the file from the table and folded it back into her jacket and went to bed. She lay in the dark and thought about 40 minutes and a document room and 15 years in her father's face in the last year before he died. The locked office, the thinning, the way he'd looked at her sometimes like he was trying to memorize something. She was almost asleep when her phone lit up. A text from an unknown number. No area code she recognized. It said, "He knows you found the file. Get out of the house tonight." She sat up. She stared at the screen. The message was already gone, the thread showing empty when she opened it, as if it had sent itself and then deleted. She got out of bed and went to the window and looked at the courtyard and the motion lights blinking steady and the gate at the far end closed and everything exactly as it always was, and felt the floor of everything she thought she understood tilt slowly, quietly beneath her feet. Someone else knew. Someone who wasn't Dante. Someone who had her number. Someone who wanted her out before tomorrow's 40-minute window, which meant either she had an ally she didn't know about, or Lucien Graves had just made his next move, and she was already standing in the middle of it. She read the empty thread 3 more times. The phone screen was the only light in the room. Outside, the motion sensors in the courtyard blinked their steady rhythm. The gate was closed. The house was quiet in the way houses are quiet when they're full of people who are awake and not making noise, which is a different quiet than empty. She put the phone face down on the bed and made herself think. Options. She had options. She could wake Dante, show him the message, but the thread was empty, and she had no proof the text had existed at all, which meant she'd be telling him she'd received a warning she couldn't verify from a source she couldn't identify, and she didn't yet know enough about his internal security to know whether telling him created more exposure than it closed. She could leave. The text had said, "Get out tonight," but leaving the estate meant going somewhere, and every somewhere she had was already known. The shop, her mother's apartment, Marcus's campus. Every address that mattered to her was a variable someone had already calculated. She could stay and do nothing and wait for morning and the 40-minute window. She sat on the edge of the bed and pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed until her pulse came down from the place the text had pushed it. Then she got up, got dressed in dark clothes, and went to find the document room herself. Tonight. Now. Without waiting for Dante's 40-minute window and whatever controlled conditions he'd planned around it, because the text meant the timeline had moved, and waiting for a plan that had been made before the timeline moved was how people got killed. She knew the West Wing's layout from 6 weeks of quiet observation. She'd never entered it officially, but she'd been adjacent to it enough times to have mapped the bones of it. The corridor that ran from the main hall, the study, the office, and the smaller room beside it that Cora's folders went into. The document room. She'd seen light under its door at night twice, which meant it had a lock, and Cora had a key, and there was probably a second key somewhere in the household administrative structure. She found Cora's key ring in the kitchen drawer where it was always kept. Cora was methodical about this, which Serena had noted weeks ago without knowing yet why the noting would matter. She took the ring, found the small brass key that corresponded to the West Wing's interior locks by process of elimination and the fact that it was newer than the others and more worn, and went. The west corridor was empty, low lighting, the kind that stayed on all night for security navigation. She moved along the wall to the document room door and tried the key and felt the lock turn with a solidity that meant good hardware, expensive, the kind of lock that didn't fail. Inside was a room about the size of a large closet, filing cabinets along 2 walls, a small table in the center with a single lamp, a desktop terminal that was locked and would stay that way. She pulled the lamp's cord and the light came on and she started with the cabinets. They were organized by year. She went to 2009 first, the year her father had begun building the holding structures, and worked forward. The files were dense, technical, the specific compressed language of financial and legal documentation. She photographed each relevant page with her phone, keeping the screen dimmed, working fast and quiet. She found it in the 2012 drawer. It wasn't labeled anything dramatic. It was a correspondence file, internal memos between the organization's financial advisors and a series of holding companies. The Moretti organization side of a network that connected through 3 layers of shells, each one documented here in precise, old-fashioned handwriting, to the same offshore structures that had run through her father's private account in the year before his company collapsed. The handwriting was Lucian Graves's. She knew it now. She'd know it anywhere. And at the bottom of the 3rd memo, in the margin, in that same hand, was a single annotation, a name she didn't recognize, and a date, R. Vale, 2013. R. Vale. Her father's name was Robert. She stood in the document room with the file in her hands and felt the floor tilt again, harder this time, and made herself keep reading. The annotation was brief, 4 lines, but what it said, stripped of its financial language, was that Robert Vale had discovered the network, had found the connection between the shells and his own account structures, had confronted, the word used was contacted, but the context made the meaning clear, had confronted someone, and that the situation required resolution before the first quarter of 2013. Her father had died in February of 2013. She put the file on the table and sat down in the single chair and pressed both hands over her mouth and breathed through her nose and did not make a sound. Her father had found out. He'd found out what was running through his network, what it was connected to, and he'd confronted someone about it. And 3 months later, he was dead. The official cause was cardiac arrest. A man of 51 with a history of stress and a company in crisis. Plausible. Clean. The kind of death that doesn't require investigation because the story around it is too coherent. She'd never questioned it. None of them had. She had been 22 years old and grief-broken and drowning in inherited debt, and she had never once questioned it. She photographed every page in the file. Then she went back through 2011 and 2012 and photographed everything that connected, building the chain forward and backward, her hands steady in a way that had nothing to do with calm and everything to do with the particular numbness that comes when an emotion is too large to fit inside a body all at once. She was replacing the last file in the drawer when she heard the sound. Not from the corridor. From inside the room, or from very close to it, the other side of the wall, which meant the study. The sound of a door. Then footsteps. Then a voice, low, speaking in a way that was clearly a phone call, The single-sided rhythm of it. Lucian Graves's voice. She killed the lamp. She stood in the total dark of the document room and pressed herself against the wall farthest from the door and slowed her breathing to something she could control and listened. He was speaking English. That was the first thing she registered. Not Italian, not the multilingual mix that moved through the estate's conversations. English. Careful and precise. The window moves to tonight, yes. The meeting tomorrow is now secondary. A pause. Because she was seen in the east corridor during the session, near the document room. Another pause, longer. I don't pay you to have opinions about timing. I pay you to execute it cleanly, and I need it done before Dante makes the connection. Silence while the other person spoke. The text was a mistake, Lucian said. His voice had dropped colder. Find whoever sent it. Yes, whoever it was had access to her number, which means it came from inside. Deal with it. A pause. The girl is the only remaining exposure. Once she's gone, the documentation defaults through the executor clause and we move within 72 hours. It's over. Footsteps. Moving away. The study door opening and closing. Serena stood in the dark for 30 seconds without moving. The text was a mistake. Find whoever sent it. Which meant the warning hadn't come from Lucian, which meant someone inside the organization had tried to protect her, and Lucian knew about it now and was going to find them. Which meant she'd just gotten someone killed by walking into this room tonight, instead of leaving the way they'd told her to. She felt that land somewhere behind her sternum, like something physical, like swallowing a stone. She waited 5 minutes by the count of her own pulse before she opened the document room door. The corridor was empty. She relocked the door, replaced the key ring in the kitchen, and went back to her room. She sat on the floor again, back against the bed, phone in her hands with the photographs she'd taken. She had the evidence. She had the chain. She had Lucian Graves's handwriting on a document that connected him to her father's account, to the network, to the notation that said R. Vale. 2013 with the specific cold weight of a problem marked for solution. She had everything she'd gone looking for. And Lucian knew she'd been near the document room, which meant the 40-minute window tomorrow was gone, which meant the plan she and Dante had quietly, carefully, not quite made, was already obsolete. And she was sitting on the floor of a room inside a house where the man who'd killed her father was currently on a phone telling someone to kill her before morning. She picked up her phone and called Dante. He answered on the second ring. No sleep in his voice. Either he hadn't been asleep or he woke fast and clean. No middle ground. I need you, she said. Now. My room. A pause. What happened? I'll tell you when you get here. He was there in under 2 minutes. She opened the door and he came in and she registered without processing it that he was dressed, which confirmed he hadn't been sleeping. She turned on the small desk lamp and sat on the edge of the bed and held out her phone with the photographs open. He took the phone. He looked at the photographs. He went through all of them, slowly, methodically, and she watched his face do the thing it did when his mind was running hard underneath a surface that had learned not to show speed. When he got to the annotation, R. Vale, 2013, he stopped. He looked at it for a long time. Your father, he said. He found the network. He confronted someone. 3 months later, he was dead. Dante's jaw moved. He looked at the photograph for another moment and then handed the phone back and walked to the window and stood there with his back to her, and she could see in the set of his shoulders the specific weight of a man absorbing something he'd half suspected and been hoping was wrong. Lucien was in the study 20 minutes ago, she said, on the phone. He said the window moves to tonight and that once I'm gone, the documentation defaults through the executor clause. She held his gaze when he turned around. He's going to move tonight, Dante. Something shifted in his face. Not fear. Something harder and more deliberate than fear. How did you get into the document room, he said. Cora's keyring. I told you tomorrow, 40 minutes. The text changed the timeline. What text? He said it fast and sharp. She showed him the empty thread. He looked at it, looked at her, and she could see him running it. Who had her number? Who inside the organization knew enough to warn her? Who Lucien was now looking for? Reyes, Dante said quietly, almost to himself. What? My head of internal security. He was the only person outside of myself who knew your number wasn't on the household system. He paused. He's been with me 8 years. Lucian said he'd deal with it. Dante's expression closed down in a way she'd never seen before, not the controlled neutral of his professional face. Something underneath that, something older and more dangerous. He took out his own phone and made a call that went unanswered, then a second, then a third to a different number and said 3 sentences in Italian she didn't catch and ended the call. Reyes isn't responding, he said. His team can't locate him. She felt sick. I'm sorry, she said, because Reyes had tried to protect her, and now he was gone, and she was the reason the timeline had moved. Don't, Dante said, not unkindly. Lucien made those choices, not you. He crossed the room. We need to move, right now, not tomorrow, tonight. Move where? There's a secondary location, a warehouse on the harbor, secure. Lucien has never been to it, and it's not connected to any structure he has access to. We get there, we establish controlled contact with the people I still trust, and we build the case from your photographs. That's not enough, she said. The photographs show the network. They don't show operational proof that he killed my father. They don't show who he's connected to outside the organization, the external parties he's been laundering for. Without the full chain, any lawyer he owns can argue document fraud and buy him enough time to... She stopped. I need the records from the terminal in the document room, the digital records, the transfer logs. The terminal is locked. I know, but Lucien accesses it remotely when he's not here, which means there's a remote access protocol, which means there's an entry point. Dante looked at her. You understand what you're describing. I understand exactly what I'm describing. She met his eyes. I need 20 minutes back in that room with someone who can get into that terminal. He was quiet for 5 seconds. She could feel him calculating. The risk of the document room against the risk of moving without complete evidence against the risk of what happened if Lucien got the executor clause to trigger before they had enough to bring him down completely. I have someone, he said. He can be here in 40 minutes. He looked at her with an expression she couldn't fully categorize, something between professional assessment and something more personal, more raw. You understand that if Lucien moves before we're out of this house, I understand. Serena. He said her name with a weight that was different from every other time. If something goes wrong, nothing's going to go wrong, she said, with a conviction she had to manufacture, but managed to make sound real. Get your person here. I'll be ready. She used the 40 minutes to write everything down. The full account. What she'd found, what she'd heard in the study, the text, the annotation, the chain of connections as she'd mapped it. She wrote it twice, sent one copy to an encrypted email she'd made years ago for documents she never wanted to lose and had never needed until now, and kept the other in her phone. She thought about Marcus, about her mother, about a Tuesday envelope in a restaurant in Midtown and a wedding that felt like a hostage exchange, and the way all of it had been arranged by a man who'd been slowly, patiently building toward this moment for 15 years. She thought about her father, 51 years old, a locked office and a thinning face and the look of a man trying to memorize something. He'd found it. He'd found the network and he'd confronted someone, probably Lucien directly, because that was the kind of man her father had been, direct and stubborn and incapable of leaving a wrong unaddressed. And Lucien had made a phone call the way he'd made a phone call 20 minutes ago, and 3 months later, her father was dead. She sat with that grief for exactly 2 minutes. She gave it 2 minutes because she owed it that, because it was real and enormous and deserved more than she could give it right now, and 2 minutes was what she had. Then she put it away. Dante's person arrived in 38 minutes. A young man, mid-20s, introduced as Marco, who carried a slim laptop bag and had the particular focused quiet of someone very good at a specific thing. No handshake, no preamble. Dante told him what was needed, and Marco nodded, and the 3 of them went to the document room. Marco had the terminal open in 11 minutes. He was faster than she'd expected, moving through the access architecture with the ease of someone who'd done this in worse conditions. She watched his screen over his shoulder. The transfer logs were there. 18 months of them. The scale of it made her breath go shallow. Not millions, but hundreds of millions, moving through the shell structures and into an international distribution network that connected to 6 separate external syndicates. Lucien hadn't just been stealing from Dante. He'd been using the Moretti organization's network as the backbone of a laundering operation that served half a dozen other criminal enterprises, and he'd been doing it for a year and a half while sitting in the conference room twice a week and shaking Dante's hand. "Download everything," Dante said. Marco was already doing it. Then his laptop screen blinked. A red indicator in the corner, small and fast. "Someone tripped the remote access alert," Marco said. His voice had gone flat. "The terminal just pinged an external monitor." "How fast?" Dante said. If Lucien has a live alert set up, Marco was already moving, ejecting the drive, closing the terminal. He knows someone's in it right now. They moved. Dante had her arm, and they were out of the document room and into the corridor, and she heard, didn't imagine, heard, the sound of the West Wing's exterior door, the one that opened to the service drive, coming open. They went the other direction. Through the kitchen, through the east corridor, into the attached garage where 2 black cars sat in darkness. Dante put her in the second car and Marco in the first, said something fast to the 2 men who materialized from somewhere near the garage entrance and got in beside her. The gate opened before the car reached it. Anton was driving. She hadn't seen him appear, but he was there, and she understood in that moment that some of this had been anticipated. Not this exact sequence, but the possibility of it. And Dante had prepared for the possibility without telling her he had, which meant he'd been running his own parallel plan to the one they'd discussed. She'd think about what that meant later. The car moved through the city for 20 minutes in a route she tracked without being able to fully map. Turns designed to establish whether they were being followed. She understood that much. Anton checked his mirrors with the rhythm of someone running a specific protocol. She sat beside Dante in the back and felt the adrenaline beginning its slow, terrible ebb, the kind that leaves you cold and shaky once the immediate thing is over and your body starts presenting the bill for what it cost. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed. "The transfer logs," she said. "Marco got them." "Yes." "It's enough. The financial chain, the network connections, my father's account. It builds a complete case." "Yes." She turned and looked at him. His face in the passing streetlights was doing something she hadn't seen before. Not the controlled neutral, not the professional calculation. Something more exposed and less managed. The face of a man who'd just discovered that 15 years of trust had been a 15-year excavation of everything he'd built. "I'm sorry," she said. He looked at her. "For what?" "He used you. He used your organization, your structure, your trust. He used everything you built." She held his gaze in the dark of the car. "That's not a small thing to absorb." Dante was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with a precision that told her he'd thought about the words before he said them, "What he did to your family is not a small thing to absorb either." It was the closest he'd come to acknowledging the weight of what she was carrying. Not sympathy exactly. It wasn't his register, but a recognition that they were both inside something that was costing them in ways that went beyond the operational. She looked away. Out the window at the city moving past. They reached the harbor warehouse 40 minutes after leaving the estate. It was industrial, cavernous, smelling of salt water and old diesel, with a security system that bore no resemblance to its exterior. Inside it was divided. Storage on one side, a functional working space on the other with equipment and communication systems and people who were already there, which confirmed that Dante had been preparing this contingency for longer than tonight. She counted 7 people. Faces she recognized from the estate's security, faces she didn't. They moved with the particular efficiency of people who'd been briefed and were executing. Marco arrived 12 minutes after them and went directly to a workstation and began building the case file from the downloaded transfer logs, layering it against the photographs from her phone, constructing the chain in a format that could be presented externally, to rival syndicates, to federal authorities, to anyone who needed to understand the scope of what Lucien Graves had built inside the Moretti organization. Serena sat at a table in the corner and watched it happen and tried to locate her own state, which was somewhere between operational focus and the enormous, deferred grief of what she'd read in that annotation. R. Vale. 2013. She was so absorbed in holding herself together that she almost missed the moment when everything changed. It was the look on Dante's face. He was across the room, reading something Marco had pulled up on a secondary screen, and she watched his expression do something she'd never seen it do. She watched it crack. Not collapse, not break completely, but crack. The way concrete cracks when the thing underneath it shifts, the stress lines visible for just a moment before the surface tries to close over them. She got up and crossed the room. The screen showed a document she didn't recognize at first, a legal filing, old format dated 2008. She read the header and her mind skipped over it and she had to read it again. It was an injunction filing. From 2008, connected to a legal dispute between two shipping companies over territorial rights in the North Atlantic corridor. One of the companies was her father's, the other was Moretti Shipping, a subsidiary company she hadn't known existed, 3 layers removed from the main organization. She read the body of the filing. Her eyes moved down the page and she felt something cold and spreading move through her chest. In 2008, her father's company and the Moretti subsidiary had been in a legal dispute. The dispute had been mediated and settled. The record said settled, closed, mutual agreement, but the financial terms of the settlement were attached. And the terms included a clause that gave the Moretti subsidiary priority access to her father's international shipping routes in the event of insolvency. In the event of insolvency. Filed in 2008, 5 years before her father's company collapsed, 5 years before his death. She looked at Dante. His face had closed back over. The crack was gone. He was looking at the screen with the neutral expression she'd spent 6 weeks learning to read, and she could not, in this moment, read it at all. "What is this?" she said. "A subsidiary filing. I can see what it is. I'm asking what it means." His jaw was tight. "It means the legal structure for the insolvency clause was established in 2008. Before Lucien started running the network." She said it carefully. "Before the transfers through my father's account." She looked at him. "This predates Lucien." "Yes." The words sat between them like a weight dropped on a table. "Dante." Her voice was very quiet. "Did you know about my father's company before Lucien brought you the intelligence on my family?" He didn't answer immediately. The non-answer was itself an answer. "How long?" she said. "Serena, how long did you know about my family?" He turned from the screen and looked at her directly, and she could see him deciding, choosing how much, choosing the angle, the specific precision of what to disclose, and she felt the anger rise in her chest, clean and cold. "Don't manage this," she said. "Don't give me the version you've decided is the right amount. Tell me the truth right now, or everything I found tonight stays on my phone, and you build your case without it." The room around them had gone quiet without anyone visibly stopping work. The particular quiet of people making themselves invisible while something important happens nearby. Dante said, "The subsidiary had a flag on your father's company from 2009. When the company went into distress, I was notified. That was the system." "You were notified?" "I didn't know about the network. I didn't know about Lucien's involvement in the collapse. I didn't know your father had been—" He stopped. "But you knew the insolvency clause existed. You knew when he died that there was a financial mechanism that connected his company's failure to the Moretti organization." "Yes." She stood with it. The enormous, weight-bearing fact of it. Dante hadn't engineered her father's death. She believed that she could see in his face that the annotation had genuinely shaken him, and that kind of shock wasn't manufactured. But he'd known for 6 years that there was a legal thread between his organization and her family's ruin. And he'd accepted Lucien's intelligence about her family, accepted the arrangement, accepted the marriage. "Did you know," she said, each word separate and deliberate, "when you agreed to the marriage, that the Moretti organization had a legal interest in the structures my father put in my name?" The silence lasted 3 seconds. "Yes," he said. She took one step back, then another. She felt the wall of the room behind her, and she put her back against it because she needed something solid, and the floor wasn't enough. 6 weeks. She'd spent 6 weeks inside his house watching him, building a careful, grudging, hard-won understanding of who he was underneath the reputation. She'd believed the highway. She'd believed the blood on his shirt. She'd believed the way he'd pulled open her car door and looked at her like the damage would have been his fault. She'd believed, not that he loved her, she was not that foolish, but that the arrangement had been straight, that whatever his reasons were, they were not the same reasons as Lucien's. But he'd known. He'd known about the subsidiary clause. He'd known his organization had a structural interest in what her father had left in her name, and he'd married her anyway, and called it a business arrangement, and told her nothing. "Get me out of here," she said. "Serena, not to the estate. Somewhere else. Somewhere not connected to you." Her voice was flat and extremely controlled. "And then I need you to stay away from me while I decide what to do with everything I found tonight. It's not safe for you to... I just found out that the man I'm married to had a legal claim on my dead father's assets and didn't tell me." She looked at him. "The last person I need telling me what's safe right now is you." He didn't argue. She saw him make the decision not to, which told her something, that he understood the specific nature of what he'd done wrong, and that arguing wasn't going to help, and that for once in the 6 weeks she'd known him, he was going to let her lead. He took her to a hotel in a part of the city she didn't know. Not luxury, functional, anonymous, the kind of place that didn't require ID if the room was paid in cash. He put Anton outside the door without asking her if she wanted security, which she let stand because she wasn't entirely irrational, and she knew Lucien was still moving. He stood in the doorway before he left and said, "I didn't know about your father until tonight. The annotation. I swear to you I didn't know." She looked at him. "But you knew enough." He didn't deny it. She closed the door. She sat on the edge of the hotel bed in a room that smelled like industrial cleaning product and old air conditioning, and held her phone with the photographs and the transfer logs and the email backup of her written account. And she thought about her father's face and Lucien Graves's voice in the study and the subsidiary clause that predated all of it. And she tried to build something she could use out of the wreckage of every version of the truth she'd believed for the past 6 weeks. Because the photographs proved Lucien. The transfer logs proved the network. The annotation proved murder, or as close to it as anything in a legal filing was going to get. What they didn't prove was where Dante's complicity ended and his genuine ignorance began, and she could not, right now, afford to make a mistake about that. Because if she was wrong about him in one direction, she was walking back into the house of the man who'd helped destroy her family. And if she was wrong in the other direction, she was throwing away the only real protection standing between her and Lucien Graves's timeline. She sat with it for a long time, long enough for the city outside the hotel window to go from deep night to the particular gray that comes before dawn, that colorless hour when everything looks like it's been drained of consequence. She made her decision, not because she trusted Dante completely. She didn't, and she wasn't going to pretend the subsidiary clause hadn't happened or that his silence about it was something she could simply absorb and move past. But trust and utility were different calculations. And right now, Lucien Graves was somewhere in the city with a phone and a timeline and an executor clause and the specific patience of a man who'd been running a 15-year plan and was not going to stop because she'd checked into an anonymous hotel. She needed to finish this. She could be angry at Dante afterward. She called him at 5:43 in the morning. He answered before the first ring completed, which meant he hadn't slept either. "The evidence goes to every rival syndicate simultaneously," she said, without preamble. "Not just federal authorities, to every organization Lucien has been running money for. We expose the full network to all of them at once. They find out he's been using their funds through a shared infrastructure without their knowledge. They find out he's the liability. They find out he's the exposure." She paused. "You take him away from every ally he has in a single move." Silence. "It burns every external connection he owns," Dante said slowly. "Overnight," she said, "which is what we need, because he moves in 72 hours and we have maybe 48. Another silence. Then, "It also exposes the Moretti organization to every one of those syndicates simultaneously." "Yes," she said, "which is why you need to be the one who sends it, voluntarily. You get ahead of it. You're not the organization that ran the network. You're the organization that uncovered it and dismantled it, and handed them the man responsible. She let that sit for a moment. You control the narrative, or Lucien does. Those are the options. The silence this time was shorter. Can you be ready in 2 hours? He said. I've been ready since my father died, she said, and meant it in more ways than she could count. She hung up and looked at the gray window and felt something settle in her chest. Not peace, not anything close to peace, but the specific gravity of a person who has identified the only path forward and is done deliberating about the cost. Whatever came next, she was not going to be the woman the envelope had been sent to. Not anymore. She was going to be the woman who sent the next one. The 2 hours passed the way time passes when your body has given up on sleep and is running on something rawer than adrenaline, a kind of stripped-down animal clarity where every detail registers with unusual sharpness and nothing feels quite real. Serena showered in the hotel bathroom, standing under water that ran too hot because she needed to feel something physical and uncomplicated. She dressed in the same dark clothes. She looked at herself in the mirror once, long enough to note that she looked exactly like what she was, someone who had been awake all night inside a collapsing situation. And then she stopped looking and went back to the main room and spent the remaining time organizing. She built the transmission package from what Marco had downloaded and what she'd photographed, layered it in an order that told the story clearly, chain of evidence first, the network connection second, the transfer logs third, and the annotation, R. Vale, 2013, last. Because the annotation was the thing that changed the nature of all the preceding documents from financial crime to something that included a man's life. She wanted whoever received it to understand the full weight of what they were looking at before they got to that page. She sent copies to 3 separate encrypted drives and kept the 4th on her phone. Dante arrived at 7:12 with Anton driving and Marco in the passenger seat, and a tension in the car that she could feel before the door opened. She got in. Nobody spoke for the first 4 minutes. Then Dante said, "Lucien's left the estate." She looked at him. When? 40 minutes ago. He took 2 vehicles, 6 men. His voice was precise and completely controlled, but she could see in the line of his jaw the thing that the control was containing. He's moving the timeline up again. He knows we have the logs. Where is he going? The harbor. She felt something cold move through her. Why the harbor? Because that's where the cargo vessel is. The one the network uses for the international transfers, physical documents, hard currency, the things that don't move electronically. It's been docked there for 3 days. He paused. It's also where Lucien has a contingency, a route out of the country if the organization moves against him. He's running. He's running after he burns everything he can't take with him. She looked out the window. The city in early morning looked provisional, like a set that hadn't been fully struck. The transmission needs to go before he gets on that ship. Once he's in international waters, I know. Dante. She turned back to him. How many captains has he turned? A pause that told her the number was worse than she'd been hoping. 4 of 7, he said. 4 of 7. More than half the organization's operational leadership. She did the math on what that meant in terms of men, resources, the practical geography of a civil war inside a criminal empire. Who's still yours? Reyes is second. A man named Carver, 2 of the harbor teams, Marco and the people at the warehouse. He looked at her steadily. Enough. She wasn't sure she believed that. She believed he believed it, which was a different thing, but it was the only thing available, so she accepted it. Send the transmission, she said. Now, before we get there. If we send it now, every syndicate on that list knows what's happening before it's finished. Some of them will move to protect their exposure. That's what we want. We want them to move against Lucien, not against you. We want them to move against Lucien after he's contained, not before, when he still has 6 men in a ship and 4 of my captains watching his back. She sat with the timing of it. He was right, and she hated that he was right. Then we have a window. A small one. The car moved through the harbor district as the sky above the water went from gray to the pale washed color of early light. The docks came into view. Industrial, concrete, the specific ugliness of working infrastructure. Cranes, containers stacked in primary colors, the smell of salt and diesel coming through the car's ventilation. Anton pulled the car into a position between two container stacks that gave them a sight line to the main dock without being visible from it. Marco was already on his laptop running communication with Carver's team, which had taken up positions at the dock's two main access points. Serena looked through the windshield at the cargo vessel. It was large, not enormous by shipping standards, but substantial, the kind of vessel that could carry enough to matter. Its running lights were on. She could see activity on the deck, men moving with the urgency of people preparing to leave. She counted what she could see. 4 visible. There would be more below. "Lucian's already aboard," Anton said quietly. "How do you know?" she said. "Because the gangway's been pulled halfway up. He's there, and he's ready, and he's waiting for something." "What's he waiting for?" Dante said, "The authorization transfer, the documentation that moves the executor clause into active status." He looked at her. "He needs a legal trigger, something that establishes you're no longer—" He stopped. "No longer alive," she said, "or no longer legally competent to hold the structures. There are 2 triggers in the clause." She looked at the ship, at the half-raised gangway, at the men on deck who were Lucien's men, operating on 15 years of the specific authority that came from being the person inside an organization who knew where everybody was buried because he'd buried most of them himself. "He's waiting for confirmation," she said slowly, "from whoever he sent after me last night." "Yes." "But they didn't find me." "No." "So he's waiting for a confirmation that isn't coming." She looked at Dante. "Which means we have a window right now, while he's still waiting, before he decides to move without it." Dante was already looking at Carver's channel on Marco's screen. She could see the positions marked. Carver's team at the north axis, 2 of the harbor team at the south, a 3rd group on the water side that she hadn't known about until now. "The ship can't leave if the harbor authority locks the channel," she said. "Can you do that?" "I have a contact," Dante said. "It costs something to call in." "Call it in." He made the call. 40 seconds, 2 sentences, an address she didn't catch. The harbor authority channel lock would take 12 minutes to process and implement. 12 minutes. "Marco," Dante said. "Prep the transmission. Hold on my signal." Marco's fingers were already moving. "Ready on your word." The radio on the dash crackled. Carver's voice clipped and low. "Movement on the south gangway. They're trying to lower it. 2 men, armed." Dante keyed the radio. "Hold positions. Do not engage until—" A sound cut across everything. Not a gunshot. Larger. An explosion from somewhere in the dock's interior. One of the warehouse structures adjacent to the main pier. A column of orange and black climbing fast against the pale morning sky. Everyone in the car moved. Anton had his weapon. Marco's laptop slid. Serena grabbed the door handle and felt Dante's hand close around her arm. "That's a distraction," he said, fast and certain. "He knew we were here." "How?" "Doesn't matter. He's moving now." He looked at her, and his face was the most unguarded she'd ever seen it, stripped of every layer of control down to something that was just the man underneath, looking at her with an urgency that had nothing professional in it. "Stay in this car." "Dante." "Serena. Stay in the car." He was out the door before she finished forming the argument. She stayed in the car for approximately 45 seconds. Then she got out. The dock had reorganized itself into chaos in under a minute. The warehouse fire was pulling attention south and east. She could hear shouting, the crack of gunfire from the north axis where Carver's team had engaged. The gangway on the cargo vessel was fully down now. Lucien's men had gotten it operational in the confusion, and she could see figures moving up it. She ran. Not toward the ship directly. Along the line of containers that ran parallel to the dock, using the cover, moving fast in a crouch. She could hear her own breathing loud in her ears and feel the concrete under her feet vibrating with something. The ship's engines, she realized. They were running. The vessel was preparing to move the moment the channel opened, but the channel was locked. 12 minutes. Maybe 8 left. She came around the end of the container row and stopped. Between her and the ship's gangway were 3 men she didn't recognize. Lucien's from the positioning. They were watching the north access where the firefight was concentrated, which meant their backs were partially to her, which meant she had approximately 4 seconds of non-visibility before one of them turned. She had no weapon. She was 25 years old and she'd grown up in a dry cleaning shop, and she had 4 seconds and a phone in her pocket containing the transmission package that needed to reach Marco. She sent it to Marco's number with a message that said, "Send it now, don't wait for Dante's signal," and pressed herself back against the container. The 3 men turned. One of them looked directly at the container stack. Then gunfire from the north access got sharply louder, and all 3 of them swung back that direction, and she moved. Down the dock, past the gangway's foot, up the first 3 steps before anyone registered she was there, and then she was on the gangway and running, and the metal was shaking under her feet with the vibration of the engines, and behind her she heard shouting. The deck of the ship was not the place she wanted to be. She knew that with complete clarity even as she crossed onto it. But the gangway behind her was now occupied by 2 of Lucian's men coming up fast, and the dock below had become a combat zone, and the ship's interior was the only direction that wasn't immediately lethal. She went through the first hatch she found, stairs going down. She took them. The interior of the ship smelled of salt water, oil, and the particular metallic cold of enclosed metal spaces. She went down 1 level, then 2, into the cargo hold's outer corridor. Dim lighting. The engine sound was a physical thing down here, a vibration she felt in her sternum and her back teeth. She stopped in a doorway and pressed herself into it and looked at her phone. Marco's channel showed 3 words: transmission sent, confirmed. It was done. Every syndicate on Lucian's network had the full chain of evidence in their hands. The financial records, the transfer logs, the holding structure connections, the proof that he'd been running their money through a shared infrastructure without their knowledge or consent. The proof that he was the liability, the exposure, the reason any one of them could be looking at federal investigation if Lucien talked. She let out a breath that she felt in her whole body. Then a door at the end of the corridor opened and Lucien Graves walked through it. He saw her at the same moment she saw him. He stopped. He was carrying a leather document case in his left hand. The physical records, the hard currency backup, the things that didn't move electronically. He looked at her with an expression that wasn't surprise exactly, more like a man doing a rapid recalculation. "Ms. Vale," he said. She stayed in the doorway. The corridor between them was maybe 15 feet. "The transmission went," she said, 2 minutes ago. "Every organization you've been running money for has the full chain." Something moved across his face. Not the recalculation anymore. Something harder and more contained. The face of a man absorbing a catastrophic development and compressing it into something he could still operate inside. "You understand what you've done," he said. "Yes." "You've exposed 6 syndicates' financial operations to a documentable evidence trail. You think they'll thank you for that. I think they'll thank Dante for handing them the man responsible before he could use what he knows about them to leverage his own exit." She held his gaze. "You're not walking out of this ship as anyone's asset. You're walking out as everyone's liability." He moved then. Not toward her. Sideways to the corridor's wall panel, and she realized too late what it was. An emergency comm station, a direct line to the men on deck. His hand reached the panel. She crossed the 15 feet. She didn't think about it. Her body made the decision before her mind finished the sentence. She hit the panel with her forearm at the same moment his hand reached it, felt the impact go up through her elbow to her shoulder, and then Lucian's other hand, the one that had been holding the document case, had her wrist, and the document case hit the floor, and she was fighting for balance on a floor that was vibrating with engine thrust, and the cold metal wall was at her back. He was 60 years old and larger than her, and he had her wrist in a grip that was going to leave bruises, and she was 25 and had grown up carrying heavy equipment in a dry cleaning shop and was angry in a way that had been building since a Tuesday envelope and had reached, in this corridor, something close to the temperature of a structural failure. She drove her knee up, felt it connect. His grip on her wrist broke and she grabbed the door frame and put herself back into the open doorway, and her shoulder was screaming and she was breathing in the ragged animal way of someone whose body has stopped asking permission. Lucian straightened. His face was controlled again, that infuriating, precise control, and he looked at her the way you look at something you've underestimated and are in the process of revising upward. "You're more like your father than I expected," he said. The words landed like a blade between her ribs. "My father," she said, breathing hard, "figured out what you were. That's why you killed him." He didn't deny it. He didn't confirm it. He just looked at her with the expression of a man who has long since passed the point where he accounts for individual costs. "The documentation in your name," he said. "It doesn't matter who has the transmission. The executor clause is still viable. You're still the only remaining—" The hatch behind him opened. Dante came through it. He was bleeding. A cut above his left eyebrow that had run down the side of his face and dried into a dark line along his jaw. His jacket was gone. He moved with the specific controlled damage of someone who had been in a fight and won it and was still paying for it. And when his eyes found her in the doorway, they did the same fast-checking thing they always did, and then moved to Lucien. The three of them stood in the corridor for a moment that felt longer than it was. Lucien looked at Dante with the expression of a man recalculating again. "The captains are done," Dante said. "Carver's team has them." His voice was completely flat. "It's over, Lucien. The channel lock lifts in 4 minutes. The channel lock is indefinite. I called in something larger than a contact." Dante took 2 steps into the corridor. "Put the case down." Lucien looked at the document case on the floor where it had fallen. He looked at Dante. He looked at Serena. She could see him running it, the transmission already sent, the captains taken, the channel locked, the men on deck neutralized or surrendered, running the math on what was left. He reached into his jacket, not for the case, for something else. Serena saw it before Dante did. The angle was wrong from Dante's position, the doorway blocking his sight line, and she did the only thing available to her, which was to move. She hit Dante from the side, her full weight driving them both into the corridor wall, and the sound that followed was enormous in the enclosed metal space, a concussive crack that she felt in her chest before she heard it. They hit the wall together. She felt Dante's arm come around her automatically, bracing the impact, and they went down to one knee on the vibrating floor, and she was waiting for the pain, cataloging her body in the fast, desperate way you do when something might be very wrong. And it wasn't where she expected it. She looked at Dante. The blood on his shirt was new, left side below the shoulder, spreading. He'd taken the shot. He'd taken it in the half-second of her pushing him sideways, had shifted his body to put himself between the weapon and her, even as she'd been trying to do the same thing for him, and the result was that the bullet had found him anyway, just not where it had been aimed. "Dante!" Her voice came out wrong, too high, too much in it. "I'm fine," he said, which was clearly not true, the blood spreading too fast for fine. But his eyes were focused and present, and he was already looking down the corridor at Lucien, who had fired once and now had no shot because Dante was up against the wall with Serena between him and the corridor, and the angle was gone. Lucien picked up the document case. He went through the door at the end of the corridor. Dante tried to stand, and she put her hand flat against his chest. "Stop! You're hit." "I know I'm hit." "Then stop moving." "Serena." He looked at her with the blood on his face and the blood spreading on his shirt, and something in his eyes that was completely unmanaged and absolutely direct. "He's going to the engine room. There's a secondary exit from the engine room to the lower deck. If he reaches it, I'll go." She was already standing. "You are not—" "You can't run." She looked at him. "I can." She looked at the phone in her hand. "Call Carver. Tell him the lower deck secondary exit. Tell him right now." She went through the door before he could finish the argument. The engine room was 2 levels down, and the noise was immense. A wall of mechanical sound that she felt in her skeleton that made the corridor walls seem to shake, that reduced every other sense to secondary. She came through the hatch, and the heat hit her like a physical thing, and the space was enormous, all machinery and catwalks, and the enormous turning mass of the ship's drive systems. She saw Lucien on the catwalk above the main engine housing, moving fast toward the far end where the secondary exit would be. He had the document case under his arm, and he hadn't seen her yet. She looked at the engine room, at the systems, at the control panel beside the hatch she'd come through. Emergency systems, Clearly labeled, the kind of panel that existed on every vessel for situations where the vessel needed to be stopped and the normal controls were unavailable. Emergency lockdown. The ship's internal security system sealed all internal hatches, locked the drive systems into idle, cut secondary power to non-essential systems. It would lock her in too. She looked at the panel. She looked at Lucien crossing the catwalk. She thought about the 48 hours she'd spent telling herself she was not going to be the woman the envelope had been sent to. She hit the lockdown switch. The sound that followed was the sound of a ship sealing itself. Hatches cycling, locks engaging, the drive system dropping from its full-throated roar to a lower register as the emergency protocols cut in. Every door in the engine room locked simultaneously, including the secondary exit at the far end of the catwalk, which sealed in Lucien's face with a sound she heard clearly even over the engine noise. He turned around. He looked down from the catwalk and found her at the panel below, and his face, for the first time in everything she'd seen him do, showed something that was not controlled. Something that was past the recalculation and past the compression and down to something raw and furious. "You've locked yourself in," he said. His voice carried over the reduced engine sound. "I know," she said. "The lockdown protocol requires external override to release." "I know that too." He stared at her from the catwalk. She stood at the panel below and felt the heat of the engine room and the vibration in her feet and the pain in her shoulder from the corridor wall, and looked back up at him and did not move. "It's over," she said. "The transmission is sent. The captains are taken. The channel is locked. And you are standing in a sealed room on a ship that isn't going anywhere, and in about 4 minutes Federal Maritime Authority is going to board this vessel because Dante made a second call that cost him considerably more than the first one." She breathed. "Put the case down, Lucien." He didn't move for a long moment. She watched him hold it. The 15 years, the network, the careful 15-year excavation of everything that could be built and controlled and used. She watched him hold all of it against what was in front of him, which was a locked door and a 25-year-old woman standing at a panel below him with blood on her sleeve that wasn't hers, and her father's name in a document, in that case, under his arm. She watched him calculate. And then, with the specific precision of a man who has decided which variable to preserve, Lucien Graves set the document case down on the catwalk railing and reached into his jacket a second time, and she saw from the angle and the way his body turned that it wasn't a weapon he was reaching for. It was a phone, and the number he was dialing, visible for just a fraction of a second on the screen as he raised it, was a number she recognized. It was Marcus's number, her brother's number. She felt the floor drop out from under her. "He's been 20 minutes from that campus all night," Lucien said. And his voice had come back to its precise, controlled register, the voice of a man who had just found the one remaining variable that changed the calculation entirely. "One call. That's all it takes. You unlock that hatch, you give me the case, you walk off this ship, and your brother goes home not knowing any of this ever happened." He looked at her across the engine room's roaring heat. "Or I make the call." She stood at the panel with her hand still on the lockdown switch and felt the specific shattering weight of the one thing she had not accounted for. The one piece Lucien had kept in reserve. The one thread he'd held back from everything she'd unraveled, saving it for exactly this moment. And understood that she was standing at the point where every choice she'd made in the last 6 weeks either held or didn't. Her hand was on the switch. Lucien's thumb was on the call button. And somewhere across the city, Marcus was 20 minutes from a campus parking garage, wearing a green jacket with a broken zipper, completely unaware that his sister was standing in an engine room on a burning timeline, making the hardest calculation of her life. She didn't move her hand from the switch. That was the first decision. Not to flinch back from the panel, not to let the sight of Marcus's number on that screen pull her body before her mind had finished working. She stood exactly where she was and breathed and did the math. Lucien had Marcus's number. He had a man 20 minutes from the campus. He had a thumb on a call button and 15 years of demonstrating that when he said something would happen, it happened. These were the facts on one side. On the other side was this. The lockdown was active, the hatches were sealed, and Lucien Graves was standing on a catwalk in a room that was getting hotter by the minute with a document case that was now the only physical evidence chain that still existed outside of Marco's encrypted drives. If she lifted the lockdown, he walked. If he walked with that case, he had enough leverage to rebuild from somewhere she couldn't reach, and Marcus would only be safe until Lucien decided he wasn't useful anymore. She understood this with complete clarity in the space of 4 seconds. Then she did something Lucien hadn't anticipated. She took her hand off the switch, put her phone to her ear, and called Anton. He answered in one ring. "Marcus," she said. "Right now. Get to him right now and don't leave him until I say so." She heard Anton move without asking a single question, which was why she'd called Anton, and she heard a car door and an engine, and she lowered the phone and looked up at Lucien on the catwalk. "Make the call," she said. He stared at her. "My man is already in a car," she said. "He'll reach Marcus before yours does. You held that card back all night, which means you only had one man on it. Someone close, but not right there. Because if you had someone right there, you'd have moved on Marcus hours ago when you realized I wasn't in the estate." She breathed. "Make the call. See who gets there first." The engine room held the sound of massive machinery and her own heartbeat, and Lucien Graves on a catwalk doing the same calculation she'd just done and arriving at the same answer. He lowered the phone. She let out the breath she'd been managing and felt her legs want to give, and did not let them. "You're going to put the case down," she said, "and you're going to sit down on that catwalk. And in approximately 3 minutes, this room is going to have federal maritime agents in it, and you are going to be their problem and not mine." He looked at her for a long moment, at the panel behind her, at the locked hatch, at the document case on the railing. He sat down on the catwalk. He didn't put the phone away. He kept it in his hand, his thumb moving to a different number, and she watched him do it and understood he was making one last move. Not Marcus, something else, some other card she hadn't seen. And she crossed to the catwalk stairs and went up them fast. She reached him before the call connected. She took the phone out of his hand with the specific physical confidence of someone who has nothing left to be afraid of, which is its own kind of dangerous, and she looked at the number he'd been dialing. It was a federal contact, a name she didn't recognize attached to a bureau extension. Someone Lucien had cultivated inside federal law enforcement. His own exit through the official channels. A deal already half-structured that would let him trade the network's external players for immunity on his own involvement. She stared at the number. Then she took a photograph of it with her own phone and pocketed both devices. Lucien watched her do it. His face had settled into something she'd never seen on it before, which was simply old. Stripped of the precision and the calibration, he looked like what he was. A man in his 60s who had spent 15 years building something that had just collapsed in a single night, sitting on a catwalk in an engine room on a locked ship with nothing left to trade. "My father," she said. She was standing above him now, the case in her hand, the phone in her pocket. The engine room's heat was enormous. "Tell me how it happened." He looked at her. "You're going to federal custody in 3 minutes," she said. "You have nothing left to leverage. Tell me." A long silence. The machinery around them was a constant physical presence, vibration and heat and the smell of hot metal. "He called me," Lucien said finally. "March 2013. He'd found the connection between his account structures and the outgoing transfers. He was—" a pause. "He was not the kind of man who could be bought. I understood that within the first minute of the conversation." "So you had him killed?" "I made a call. Someone else made the arrangements." His voice was flat, reporting, the way a man reports something he filed away long ago and stopped feeling. It was clean, consistent with his medical history. She stood in the heat and felt the grief move through her again, the enormous architectural grief of it, and this time she didn't compress it into 2 minutes and put it away. She let it be what it was for a moment. Her father at 51, a locked office door, a thinning face, a man who had found something wrong and done what he did, which was confront it directly, and died for it. "He was protecting us," she said. Not to Lucien, mostly to herself. "He was trying to." "You took that from him." Lucien didn't answer. The hatch at the engine room's lower level opened. She heard boots on the metal stairs, multiple, moving fast and organized. She looked down and saw the first of the federal maritime agents come through, identified by the vest and the credentials, followed by 2 more, and behind them, moving more carefully because of the wound and the stairs, but moving nonetheless. Dante. He looked up and found her on the catwalk immediately. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her in the car outside the hotel. Stripped down, unmanaged, the face underneath the face. She held up the document case so he could see it. Something moved through his expression. Not relief exactly. Something more complicated and more honest. The agents took Lucien off the catwalk with the efficient professionalism of people executing a prepared warrant, which meant the federal contact Dante had called wasn't just a channel lock. It was a full operation, something that had been in motion longer than tonight, something that had been building toward this moment from a direction she hadn't known about. She filed that away. One of the agents spoke to her briefly, took her name, told her she'd need to come to the federal building for a formal statement. She said yes. She handed over Lucien's phone and told the agent about the federal contact number on it, the cultivated insider, the pre-structured immunity deal. The agent's expression changed in a way that told her that information was significant, and she didn't know yet the full shape of how significant. She went down the catwalk stairs. Dante met her at the bottom. He was upright, which cost him something she could see in the careful way he was holding his left side, the wound dressed in a field bandage that someone had applied between the corridor and now. She stood in front of him and looked at the bandage and the dried blood on his face, and the fact that he was standing at all, and felt the complex, unresolved weight of everything that existed between them. Anton got to Marcus, he said before she could speak. He's safe. He doesn't know anything. She let out a breath. The case, Dante said, looking at it in her hand. Complete physical evidence chain, hard currency records, original transfer authorizations, the notarized executor clause documents with his signature. She held it out to him. He took it. It corroborates everything Marco built from the digital records. It's enough, he said. It's more than enough. She looked at him steadily. The subsidiary filing, the 2008 clause. I need to know everything about it, not the version you've decided is the right amount. All of it. I know, he said. Not here. No, not here. She looked around the engine room, at the federal agents processing the space, at the machinery that was winding down now that the lockdown had been manually released from the outside, at the hatch through which Lucien Graves had just been walked into custody. At the space where 15 years of careful, patient destruction had finally run out of room to move. She was very tired. The specific bone-deep exhaustion of a night that had asked for everything and taken most of it. Can we go? She said. Yes, he said. We can go. The federal statements took 4 hours. She sat in a building that smelled like floor cleaner and burnt coffee and answered questions from 2 agents who were thorough and professional and gave nothing away about how the investigation had been running parallel to everything she'd been living inside, though she gleaned enough from the questions to understand that Dante's federal contact was not recent. It had been cultivated over years, carefully, in exactly the same way that Lucien had cultivated his own. And that at some point, months ago, Dante had begun feeding the operation intelligence about the network structure while simultaneously running his own parallel accounting on who inside his organization was the source. He'd known Lucien was the problem longer than 3 weeks. She understood that during the 4th hour of questioning, sitting in a chair in a federal building with her shoulder aching and her father's name in a document that was now federal evidence, and she sat with it and let it be complicated. He'd been moving his own pieces. So had she. The difference between what he'd withheld and what she'd withheld was largely one of timing and architecture, and she was honest enough with herself in that cold fluorescent room to acknowledge it. She didn't forgive him for the subsidiary clause. That was a different thing, older, more structural, the specific wrong of knowing a mechanism existed and using it anyway. But she understood the shape of it better than she had at 5:43 in the morning, when she'd called him from a hotel room running on stripped-down clarity and borrowed time. Understanding wasn't the same as forgiveness, but it was where forgiveness sometimes eventually started. Marcus called while she was waiting for the final paperwork. She answered. Hey, he said, there's a guy outside my building. I know, he works for me. A long pause. Works for you? I'll explain later. Are you okay? I'm fine. Serena, there's a lot of news coming out about... She could hear him scrolling something. About the Moretti organization and some federal operation, and I know about that too. Are you? His voice did the thing it did when he was 19 and trying to be older than that. Are you safe? She looked at the federal building's ceiling, at the fluorescent lights and the institutional gray of a room that existed to process things that had gone very wrong in the world. Yes, she said, I'm safe. The debt, he said quietly, all of it. Was it real? The question landed differently than she expected. She'd been prepared for many questions, but not for that one, not delivered in that particular tone, which told her that Marcus, who was 19 and perceptive and had been carrying his own version of the family weight in ways she'd been too busy protecting him to fully see, had been doing his own math for longer than she'd known. It was real, she said, and it's gone. All of it. A silence. Serena, he said, what did you do? She looked at the window of the federal building where the city was visible beyond the glass, doing what cities do in the afternoon, indifferent to the specific human weight being processed inside its buildings. What I had to, she said. I'll tell you everything when I see you, not on the phone. He accepted that the way he'd always accepted the things she asked him to accept without explanation, which was with the specific trust of someone who has spent their life understanding that the person asking has a reason. She'd spent years earning that trust, and sometimes it was the heaviest thing she carried. Okay, he said. Be careful. I'm already done being careful, she said. She meant it as reassurance. It also happened to be true. The federal case moved fast once the evidence chain was in official hands. The transmission she'd sent from the engine room, Marco's package, sent to every syndicate on Lucien's network, did exactly what she'd calculated it would do. 6 external organizations received simultaneous documentation that Lucien Graves had been running their money through a shared infrastructure without disclosure, that he was the source of an evidence trail that could expose each of them to federal investigation, and that the Moretti organization had voluntarily surfaced the full network and was cooperating with authorities. 3 of the 6 made their own approaches to federal investigators within 48 hours. The other 3 went quiet in the specific way that organizations go quiet when they are cutting a dead weight loose and don't want the sound of it to carry. Lucien's federal contact, the cultivated insider he'd spent years positioning as his exit, was suspended and under internal investigation within 72 hours of the phone being handed over. The immunity deal that had been half-structured collapsed without its inside support. Lucien's attorneys were skilled and expensive, and they worked with the specific focused energy of people being paid enormous sums to salvage something from total wreckage. And what they eventually salvaged was a plea arrangement that kept him out of the most public trial, but put him away for a stretch of years that he would not, at his age and in his condition, finish. She was not in the room when the plea was entered. She didn't need to be. What she needed to do, and did, was spend 3 days with a forensic accountant and the federal investigators building the evidentiary case for what had happened to Robert Vale in February of 2013. The cardiac arrest. The death that had fit so neatly into the story of a man collapsing under his own failure that no one had looked behind it. The man Lucien had called, the person who had made the arrangements, was identified through the same 15-year paper trail that had identified everything else. He was not a dramatic figure. He was a contractor, mid-level, who had kept his own records with the same methodical thoroughness that made the world's worst people so often easier to prosecute than its best ones. He was arrested in a city she'd never been to, extradited, and added to the collapsing structure of charges that Lucien's plea arrangement had bought a partial exit from, but not a complete one. Her father's death was reclassified. The official record changed. She sat in a federal attorney's office and watched someone stamp a document and felt the specific weight of 7 years lift off a part of her spine she hadn't known was holding it. She didn't cry in the office. She waited until she was in the car, and then she did, briefly and completely, and Anton drove without acknowledging it in a way that she appreciated more than she could have said. Her mother was the hardest conversation. She sat across from her at the kitchen table of the apartment that was now fully and unencumbered theirs, the mortgage cleared, the debt erased, and told her everything. Not a managed version. Not the amount she'd decided was the right amount. Everything. The envelope, the restaurant, the marriage, the file behind the radiator, the engine room, the annotation, what Lucien had told her on the catwalk. Her mother sat across from her and listened without speaking for a long time. She was 61 years old and had spent 7 years operating a dry cleaning shop and believing her husband had failed and quietly carrying the grief of that belief alongside the grief of losing him. And the two griefs had become so layered over 7 years that she'd probably stopped being able to separate them. Serena watched her mother's face absorb it. The failure that wasn't failure, the collapse that was murder, the debt that was manufactured, the 7 years of weight that had been built on a lie. Her mother pressed both hands flat on the table, the same gesture Serena used without knowing she'd learned it from her, and breathed. "He found it," her mother said finally. Not a question. Yes, he found what was running through his network, and he confronted the person responsible. "That was your father." Her mother's voice was steady in the specific way of someone who is holding something enormous very carefully. "He never could leave a wrong thing alone." "No." "He would have known it was dangerous." "Probably. And he did it anyway." Her mother looked at her hands on the table. "Because that was the kind of man he was." Serena felt her throat tighten. "Yes." Her mother sat with it for a long time. Serena let her. The apartment was quiet around them. Afternoon light, the distant sound of the street, the particular quality of silence in a room where something true has just been said out loud for the first time. "My girl," her mother said eventually, looking at her. "What you did?" "I did what he would have done," Serena said. "Eventually." Her mother looked at her for a moment that contained 7 years and a kitchen table and the specific, unspoken recognition between two women who had held a family together through something they hadn't known the full shape of. Then she reached across the table and covered Serena's hand with hers, and didn't say anything else, because there wasn't anything else that needed to be said. The conversation with Dante was not at the estate. The estate was in a transitional state. The legal and operational restructuring of the Moretti organization's legitimate holdings was underway, a process that would take months and involve the careful untangling of 15 years of Lucien's architectural interference from the actual bones of what Dante had built. Some things would survive, some wouldn't. He was engaged in the specific, unglamorous work of finding out which was which and deciding what to do about both. She requested a meeting the way you request a meeting with someone you're not sure how to be around anymore. Through a mutual channel, a specific time, a neutral location. He came without objection. That told her something. They met at a coffee place near the harbor. Not dramatic. Daylight, ordinary noise, the smell of espresso, and the particular afternoon light of a city going about its business. She was there before him. He came in and found her at the corner table and sat down and ordered nothing, which meant he intended to be direct, which she appreciated. "The subsidiary," she said. "No preamble." "Yes." "Tell me from the beginning." He told her. The full version. Not managed, not the right amount. The 2008 filing, the legal dispute with her father's company, the settlement terms. The flag the subsidiary had on Robert Vale's company from 2009. The notification in 2013 when the company went under. He'd known there was a legal connection. He'd known when Lucien brought him the intelligence on her family that the connection existed. He told himself the motivations were separate, that the business logic of the documentation structures was distinct from the subsidiary clause, that one didn't implicate the other. "You told yourself a story," she said. "Yes." "That let you do what you already wanted to do." He was quiet for a moment. The documentation was genuinely valuable. The arrangement was genuinely strategic. "I know," she said. "That's what made it easy to tell yourself." He looked at her directly. There was nothing in his face that was trying to manage the conversation. "I know what I did," he said. "I'm not asking you to excuse it." "What are you asking?" He was quiet for a moment that felt like something being weighed very carefully. "I'm asking what you need," he said, "to move forward, in whatever direction that is." She looked at him. At the harbor light coming through the coffee shop window behind him, and the dried mark on his jaw where the cut had healed, and the stillness he wore that she'd spent weeks learning to read and now read without effort, which was itself a kind of intimacy she hadn't planned for and wasn't sure what to do with. The marriage, she said, can be dissolved whenever you want. The documentation structures are being unwound through the federal process. You'll be legally clear of all of it within 4 to 6 months. She nodded. She'd known that. She'd asked the federal attorney. And after that, she said. He looked at her. What does the organization look like, she said, after the restructuring? Smaller, legitimate. Shipping, logistics, 3 port operations on the East Coast that were always clean and stay clean. He paused. It's what I was building before Lucian spent 15 years building something else inside it. How long to finish? A year, maybe 18 months. She looked at the table, at her coffee cup, at the specific afternoon light that made everything look provisional and real at the same time. She thought about a Tuesday envelope and a restaurant in Midtown and the way she'd sat in the chair by the window, her first night in his house, watching motion lights blink on and off until 4 in the morning. She thought about a corridor and a chute and his arm coming around her automatically, bracing the impact before his mind had finished deciding to. She thought about her father, about the kind of wrong you can't leave alone. I want the subsidiary clause formally dissolved, she said, in writing, before anything else. Already drafted, he said. I had it drawn up before I came here. He reached into his jacket and put a single folded document on the table between them. She picked it up. She read it. It was exactly what it needed to be. Clean, complete, the legal mechanism that had existed between his organization and her father's memory formally and permanently closed. She folded it back up and put it in her bag. I need time, she said. I know. I'm not... She stopped. Started again. I don't know what this is. What we are. I know what it started as. I know what it cost. I don't know what it's worth now, and I need time to find out. Okay, he said. She looked at him. That's it? Okay? What do you want me to say? I don't know. Something. He looked at her with the face she'd learned over weeks and could now read clearly, and what it said was, "This matters," stated plainly and without theater, the way he stated everything that was true. I'll wait, he said, for as long as it takes. And if it takes longer than that, I'll still be somewhere you can find me. She sat with that. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a promise dressed up in language designed to move her. It was a man who had spent his life in rooms where nothing was said plainly, saying one plain thing, and the plainness of it was what got through. She nodded. She picked up her coffee cup. She drank the last of it, which was cold, and set it down. The shop on Keller Street, she said. I'm reopening it Monday. He looked at her. Full operation. I'm going to hire 2 more people and expand the hours, and eventually I want to move to a bigger space on the north end of the block. She looked at the table. My father built something from nothing. So did I. I'm not going to stop because the thing I was protecting it for is gone. She looked up. I'm protecting it for itself now. Good, he said. Simple and certain and without any performance of approval. Just good. She left the coffee shop before he did. She walked out into the afternoon city and stood on the sidewalk for a moment and let the noise of it settle around her. Traffic and voices and the distant sound of the harbor that was always there in this part of the city if you knew to listen for it. She called Marcus from the sidewalk. Hey, he said. Are you busy tonight? No. Why? Because Mom's making dinner and I told her I'd ask you. She's making the soup. A pause. The good one with the... Yes, that one. I'll be there at 7. She hung up and started walking. Not toward a car. Not toward anything in particular. Just walking. The way you walk when you've been inside something enormous for a long time, and the outside air is a thing you want to spend time in without purpose. The harbor was 4 blocks east. She walked toward it without deciding to. She'd been here before. This specific stretch of waterfront, the working end of it, not the renovated tourist section, but the real harbor with its concrete and its cranes and its smell of salt water and the particular industrial music of a working port. She'd come here the week after her father died, 22 years old and grief-broken, and trying to understand how the world could contain something as ordinary as a working harbor on a Tuesday and also contained the enormous fact of a man being gone. She stood at the railing at the water's edge and looked out at it. At the ships moving in the distance, ordinary cargo vessels going about ordinary commerce, and the cranes at the far terminal working in their slow, deliberate rhythm, and the water doing what water does, which is move and reflect and refuse to hold the shape of anything you pour into it. She thought about her father standing somewhere like this in the last months of his life, having found the wrong thing and knowing he was going to confront it. She thought about the locked office and the thinning face and the look she'd misread at the time as defeat and understood now was something else. Was the specific gravity of a man carrying a decision. He'd carried it alone. That was the thing she couldn't quite resolve, the thing she'd probably be working on for a long time. He'd carried it alone because he was protecting them, the same way she'd carried things alone for 7 years. The same reflex, the same instinct, the same belief that the people you love are best protected by keeping the weight away from them. She'd learned, slowly and at considerable cost, that this wasn't always true. Sometimes the weight needed to be shared. Sometimes protection meant bringing people into the real shape of things, rather than building a managed version around them and hoping it held. She didn't know yet if she'd learned it thoroughly enough. She suspected she'd keep needing to relearn it. That was probably the nature of it. The harbor light was doing something beautiful in the late afternoon. That particular gold that comes when the sun is low and the water catches it and gives it back changed, brighter and less certain than it started. She stood in it and felt the wind off the water and the cold of the railing under her hands and the specific, unfamiliar sensation of a burden she'd been carrying so long, she'd stopped feeling its weight having been set down. Not removed. Set down intentionally, in a place she could see it clearly. Her father's name was clean. The debt was gone. Marcus was going to walk into her mother's apartment at 7 o'clock tonight with no idea how close things had come, which was both a mercy and a debt of a different kind that she'd spend years deciding how to pay. Lucian Graves was in federal custody with a plea arrangement that would outlast his health. Reyes, whose name she now knew fully, and whose family she'd contacted through federal channels the week after the ship, had not been found alive. She carried that. She would carry it. She was 25 years old, and she was tired in a way that went down to the structural level, and she was also, standing at this railing in this harbor light, more certain of who she was than she had ever been in the 25 years before this one. That was the thing that surprised her most. Not the exhaustion, not the grief, the certainty. Built out of the hardest materials available, paid for at a price she would not have chosen, but real in a way that nothing built cheaply ever was. She stayed at the railing until the light changed and the harbor went from gold to the flat gray of early evening, and the cranes at the far terminal finished their shift and went still. Then she straightened up, let go of the railing, and turned back toward the city. She had a dinner to get to. She had a shop to open Monday. She had a year, maybe 18 months, to figure out what a thing was worth. She walked.